In this last discussion for Unit 4, we're going to look at conflict between individuals in the same species. Now, there are many types of conflict. One of the simplest is conflict between non-kin. Those are individuals that are not related to one another. And a lot of this revolves around territory or mating or a combination of the two. But there are other things that they may be competing over, other resources, food resources, or other things. Now, in many cases, this conflict among non-kin reaches some sort of an evolutionarily stable strategy, meaning that everyone's going to exhibit about the same behavior. So, for instance, if you're super aggressive, that may not be the best strategy because you might be fighting in times when you don't have to, putting yourself at risk and injuring yourself in places where you don't have to. So typically, if there's some sort of a fight for mate or territory or something, there'll be some display of aggression, maybe pushing each other around or banging on each other a little bit, stabbing each other, trying to stab each other with your horns, but not so much that it's very frequently going to result in damage. And usually they'll push each other around a little bit, and then the one that recognizes that they're at a disadvantage will retreat. And that is the best strategy for these sorts of interactions most of the time. So they reach this kind of a stable place. In fact, sometimes they won't even fight. They'll just kind of demonstrate and size each other up. Maybe just make sure that, okay, yeah, you really are as big as you look. You don't just have fluffy fur or something. And they'll do just enough to kind of assess information, and then there'll be very little conflict. And so these stable strategies work well because they preserve advantages, but they also prevent individuals from damaging themselves or at least risking having too high a risk of injury when they are competing and conflicting with other organisms in their species. Now, there are many more complex and interesting interactions that occur between related individuals, and these are more complex because the rules of the game are a little bit more complicated. So, for instance, if you are competing against a non-relative, basically you want to win. If they lose, it doesn't really hurt you at all, and if you win, you benefit greatly. And so, typically, the best strategy is to whatever it's going to do to win without damaging you too much. However, when we're looking at interactions between members of the same family that are closely related, the game gets much more complicated. So let's look at this parent-offspring conflict. Now, parents' fitness is completely tied up in their offspring, right? Because our definition of biological fitness is your ability to reproduce and contribute to the next generation. So you have to reproduce, your offspring have to do well if you're going to have fitness. But there is a cost to those offspring also. There are some risks, maybe of predation. There's some risks of you giving up all of your energy and time and putting yourself at risk, maybe getting sick or having a predator eat you. So it's not just 100%, let's have as many babies as we can and give them everything. That may not overall be the best strategy depending on the environment. So there is this conflict between parents and offspring. And particularly if you have more than one offspring at the same time, there's a conflict between what is best for each individual offspring and what's best for the parent. So very simply put, for each offspring, their best strategy is going to be to get as many resources as they can. And sometimes in the right environment, that might even be at the cost of hurting their sibling, although there is a kinship cost there. Okay? The parent's best strategy is to try and spread their resources evenly across all of their offspring, because that's going to maximize the potential for each of those offspring for surviving. You don't want to give 90% of your resources to one offspring and 10% to the remaining offspring, because those remaining offspring won't have much of a chance of surviving, and that's wasted resources. So we want to spread our resources evenly. And this results in some very interesting behaviors, but also results in some interesting phenotypes that have been selected for because they've popped up randomly and then there's natural selection working on them. So one really kind of fun example is this polyandrous versus monogamous primates and their fetuses. Now, mammals don't have the option to behaviorally change how much resources are given to their offspring until they're born. Once they're born, there can be those decisions. But when they're born, basically the body is set up to give a certain amount of resources to that developing fetus. and realize that that's a big cost to the mother. She's going to slow down. She's going to be using resources that she could be used to maintain her health and her strength to grow those fetuses in her womb. And so there is this trade-off for the mother. Now, this prediction in polyandrous systems, remember a polyandrous system is where one female has more than one mate available. And so in polyandrous systems, females have more support, more protection, perhaps more food being brought into them. And so the prediction is that polyandrous primates have the potential to grow larger fetuses because the mother has more support from multiple mates. Whereas in a monogamous system, you only have a single mate and you don't have as much support. And so in fact, if we do this experimentally, this bears out. Polyandrous primates, on average, have larger babies than monogamous primates. And so that's been selected for because of the mating system. So we can see how these complex interactions might have a different outcome on one species versus another. And this can be even a little bit, I don't know, from a human perspective, we look at it and say, oh, that's awful, that's terrible, why would that ever happen, right? But there can be quite strong parent-offspring conflict. For instance, in some rodent species where the mother has the potential to reproduce year after year after year, there's actually evolved behavior where if it's a bad year, the mother will abandon her babies because that maximizes her fitness. Mothers that abandoned their babies in the past did better because they lived more frequently and were able to have babies in successive years, right? Whereas if you are living in an environment where there's very little chance of you having more babies, that's going to select for much stronger mother protection and much less of a chance of abandoning the offspring. And in some cases, it's even to an extreme where not only will the mother abandon her babies, but before she does that, she will cannibalize her own children. Now, when I was looking for a good image to illustrate this, this is what I found. Now, obviously in humans, I don't know what intent this was, hopefully it was humorous. In humans, because we have so many resources invested in each of our offspring, there's really, really strong both paternal and maternal instincts to protect those babies and not to abandon them very rarely, and certainly not to eat them, right? That's a very extreme thing, and from a human perspective, we look at it and say that's awful. But from a rodent perspective, right, if you are going to die yourself, and your babies are never going to survive in that extreme year, right? This is not going to happen all the time, but if you have an extreme drought or an extreme lack of food, if you're going to have to abandon those babies anyway, those are wasted resources. And so rodents that cannibalize their babies might do better overall than organisms that don't under those situations. So that can be a harsh and kind of seemingly extreme behavior, but it's a benefit for those. And we should not impose our own moral judgments, our own moral system on these animals. Again, they're not doing it by choice. Well, they're not doing it volitionally. They're not trying to decide, oh, I really should eat my babies. It's just a behavior that evolved, and it's not a moral or an amoral thing. It's just a behavior for them. We see this also in other instances. So there are often mate and offspring conflicts. And The Lion King, the Disney movie, is a great example of this. And they drew it largely from real behaviors in lions. When a new lion a new male takes over a pride, he often will kill all of the small babies in that pride. Now, for him, that's a benefit because females are not available for mating until their babies are weaned. And so if he just waits and waits and waits, he has fewer offspring overall. And so males that killed babies in the past that weren't theirs were doing much better overall because on average they would have more offspring. Now realize this is a detriment to the mother. She's invested time and resources into that baby, and it's not going to be a benefit for her to allow the male to kill that baby. So often there is some sort of a pushback, a conflict between the new mate and the female as she tries to protect her cubs. But because males are so much bigger and females can reproduce again, often it's fairly limited protection, because the females that really, really protected their offspring would get injured and would die. And so there's these really complex interactions. And then finally, our last example here, this is the awful example of conflict from a human perspective at least. Blue-footed boobies are a seabird. they find these small islands to nest, and then the parents, both male and female, will bring food for the babies. Now, it looks like in the past there was much more food available for the blue-footed boobies. This is not due to really much human interaction. This is just general trends that have occurred. And the reason why we think that in the past there was more food available is because genetically these blue-footed boobies are programmed to lay 2 eggs. So almost all the females lay 2 eggs. However, they're only able to gather enough food most years to support a single chick. They can't feed both chicks, but their tendency is to try and spread it evenly. Now, the best case solution for that obviously would be to stop laying 2 eggs. But that's not something that birds can decide. I don't know if they'd be smart enough to decide even if they could. They're just genetically programmed. And so the trend to only lay a single egg has not yet evolved. If it does, it will probably be selected for, and that's the overall best solution. But until that random mutation occurs in this population, there is a next best strategy that has evolved. And this is aggressive behavior in the chicks. And so when the chicks are born, the one that is born first, or the one that gets the most food and grows the fastest, will begin to peck and fight, and eventually will push out of the nest or even outright kill its sibling. And again, this is not the best strategy because we have all these wasted resources in that chick still. However, it works better than not having that aggressive behavior around at all, because if both chicks are around and they don't have some sort of a culling, some sort of a selection of one over the other, then there's a really high chance that both of them will die. So this is a good reminder. Evolution doesn't find the best solution, at least not immediately, but it does find solutions that are better than what was there previously. And so with enough experimentation, we may find the overall best strategy, but in the meantime, or there might be different strategies that are better than what was there before, but not overall the best strategy. And we can see this at the genetic level also. So meiotic drive is a really interesting thing that occurs at the genetic level, where some alleles are actually able to fight against and outcompete other alleles in the population. This is basically conflict among alleles. And so meiotic drive can be a very interesting form of this type of complex behavior, but at the genetic level. And that's really all you need to know. Meiotic drive is a really interesting thing, and people are using it now in conjunction with new modern molecular techniques to potentially do some really dramatic and maybe controversial things. So for instance, using meiotic drive and a new genetic tool called CRISPR, which is basically a cut and paste for DNA, we think it's possible that we could basically use almost what you would think of as reverse natural selection to drive a species to extinction. Now you say, why would we do that? Aren't we trying to save out all these species? Well, they're thinking about it for very particular applications, like for instance, Anopheles gambia, which is the malaria mosquito. There may be some ecological impacts if we were to extinctify, I don't even know if that's a word, but to cause Anopheles gambia to go extinct. Now, the reason why we may want to do that is Anopheles gambia has this massive impact on the human population because it's the carrier for the malaria protozoa. And hundreds of millions of people every year are still impacted, some even die from malaria. So if the ecological risks are not too great, we may want to use meiotic drive to cause a species to go extinct. And meiotic drive is just, it happens naturally and we're just taking advantage of it. So just know its definition, which is basically at the allelic level, we can have these conflicts between different alleles, and that can have a dramatic impact on natural selection. So in order for these interactions to be maintained, there needs to be some sort of communication. This can be visual communication, it can be chemical communication, or auditory communication. There are many, many different forms. So for instance, behavior amongst mammals is often a communication. You can look at a mammal and see what their mood is. Are they aggressive? Are they submissive? This is especially important among social organisms like wolves, right? So if you look at wolves and our dogs, which are just domesticated wolves, you can see many of these behaviors that have caused them to evolve this very social hierarchical system of the pack. So in order for a signal to be maintained long term, it needs to be honest, meaning it can't be faked. If it's faked, then that will risk the structure of the society. And so many things have evolved to maintain the integrity of those signals. So for instance, if a signal is very, very costly, it really can't be faked. So if it takes lots of energy and good health to be big and large, then that's not something that you can really fake. And particularly if there's a check every once in a while. So if you grow lots of big hair, you have a mutation where you grow really, really fuzzy coat, it might make you look large. And so other bears might tend to stay away from you if you look that big, but because there's some testing, right, they're not just going to take it at face value. They'll push you around a little bit, maybe interact with you to see if you really are as big as you look. So that keeps that signal on. So now there's no benefit to having mutations that make you look bigger and fuzzier and scarier if they're actually testing you, okay? But a costly signal can be honest. And of course, then the other thing that keeps a signal honest is if there's some sort of a testing, some sort of a social reinforcement. So for instance, in wasps here, this bright yellow frontal part of your face is a signal that you are healthy and strong. But it's not very costly to have bright yellow ones. Energetically, it takes as much to make a bright yellow face as it does to make these spotted faces, which are signals of less fitness. And so the only reason that this signal has been maintained is because it's tested, that individuals with big yellow faces will test and check and push around and fight with these other individuals. And if they are exhibiting a trait that is not honest, so if you have they actually did this experiment where they went into these poor wasps and they took a little bit of paint and they painted the ones with the black spots yellow. And so if we looked at an individual like this and then an identical individual but that had been painted yellow, the individual that was painted yellow saw much more conflict with individuals. They would test them and then they would really, really go after them if they were exhibiting a false signal. So that is a social reinforcement of that signal, and that's one of the ways that we can maintain integrity of these signals that are so key for these interactions. All right, that wraps up Unit 4.